How many of you are in the middle of a storm? Let me explain what I mean by that. Sometimes life is kind of clear sailing, isn't it? I mean, everything's just going smooth, everything's cruising along so nice. And then other times, you're just battling to stay afloat. There is almost always a storm brewing somewhere in my life. And sometimes I'm just smack dab in the middle of one. And so that's what I mean. How many of you are currently in the middle of a storm? Can I see your hands? Ooh, look at all of you. Ooh, wow. Not surprising. Life's stormy, isn't it? Well, if, by the way, you didn't raise your hand, you will be in one soon. So today we're going to read a story about Jesus and his disciples getting into a boat and going across Lake Galilee, and a storm blows up. And it's a terrific storm. And we're going to see what happens, and we've got some cool things to learn. All right, so if you have a Bible, and if you don't, now's the time to pass the Bibles down the aisles. Make sure everyone's got a Bible. And we're going to turn to page 888. This is Luke chapter 8. We're going to start at verse 16. Luke chapter 8, verse 16. And here's the deal. I'm going to read from verse 16 to 25. And we're only going to talk about the last few verses. We're just going to talk about this storm story today. I've got limited time, so that's what we're going to focus on. But Luke chapter 8, starting at verse 16, here we go. Let's see what it says. Jesus says, "No one lights a lamp and hides it under a clay jar or puts it under a bed. Instead, they put it on a stand so that those who come in can see the light. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and there is nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. Therefore, consider carefully how you listen. Whoever has will be given more. Whoever does not have, even what they think they have, will be taken from them." Now, Jesus' mother, the brothers plural, Jesus' mother, singular, and brothers plural, came to see him, but they were not able to get near him because of the crowd. And someone told him, "Your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to see you." And Jesus replied, "My mother and brothers are those who hear God's word and do what? Put it into practice. They do it." One day Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." And so they got into a boat and they set out. As they sailed, he fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake so that the boat was being swamped and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him up saying, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." He got up and rebuked the wind, and the raging waters and the storm subsided, and all was calm. "Where's your faith?" he asked his disciples. In fear and amazement, they asked one another, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." All right, so a little background. There are three things. You can see if you've got an outline out there. There are three things we're going to talk about tonight real quickly. But let me just kind of retell the story and fill in a little background for you. So the story takes place on Lake Galilee. This is a lake. There we've got a satellite image of the lake. And it's from top to bottom, it's 13 miles long. At its widest point, it's 7 miles across. And the lake, because it's situated in the Jordan Rift Valley, is 700 feet below sea level. Think about that for a minute. 700 feet below sea level. It is the lowest freshwater lake on the planet. And the only lake lower than this is the Dead Sea, which of course is made up of salt water. The Jordan River comes from the mountains to the north of Lake Galilee, flows down into the lake, and then flows through the lake, goes out the south, and heads down to the Dead Sea, which is 1,412 feet below sea level. All right, you're thinking, hey, great, thanks for the geography lesson. Hang on to it. It will be important in a moment. All right, so the land around the lake, around Lake Galilee, was very fertile land, and the lake itself was full of fish. So in Jesus' time, there were a couple dozen villages that either farmed or fished, or both, that were dotting the shores of the lake. Jesus and his disciples were up on the west side of Lake Galilee, and Jesus announced they were going to the other side. And I think we've got, yeah, there we go. So they're up, you can see Lake Galilee up there, and so they're up in this, up by Tarakea, they're up in that northwest part. They're going to go across to the eastern part, and you'll notice the word Decapolis there. The word Decapolis means 10 cities. And on the eastern side of the lake, there were 10 different cities, and most of these were Gentile cities. So the western side of the lake, mostly Jewish, eastern side of the lake was mostly Gentile. So when Jesus said, we're going to the other side of the lake, it was not just other geographically, but it was other racially, socially, and spiritually too. The other side, the region of Decapolis, most everyone who lived there would have been called pagans. In fact, there was actually a rabbinic tradition in Jesus' day that the 7 nations of Canaan that were driven out by the Israelites when they entered the Promised Land, that those 7 nations resettled on the eastern shores of Lake Galilee. So the other side was filled with pagan temples that featured exaltations of violence or sex or greed. The pig, which was of course unclean in Israel, was used in worship on the other side. The Jews regarded the other side as the place where Satan lived. It was dark, it was evil, it was oppressive. And good Jews avoided the other side, especially Jewish rabbis. But not Jesus. Jesus goes to the other side. It's almost like he thinks he owns the place. Like the other side was his side too. And of course, I've been saying each week one of Luke's favorite themes is the inclusivity of Jesus. Jesus is for everyone. Jesus included the people who'd been excluded. Jesus went to the other side. Jesus went to the other side. Jesus moved toward the other and included them. You know, for the last couple of years now, I've been beating this drum. I know some of you are getting tired of hearing it, but I'm saying it over and over again because I want you to get it. Move toward the other. Move toward the other. Move toward the person who's different than you. Move toward that person of a different race. Move toward that person of different political persuasions. Move toward that person of a different belief system. Move toward them and ask some questions. Tell me your story. Let me get to know you. Because when you become friends, the other begins to look very, very different. Make a new friend. You know, as long as we just stay in our own little enclaves, right? As long as we stay in our own little safe spaces and we don't go to the other side, we can just put a label on those other. Oh, you're one of those, right? You're from the other side. Yeah, we don't have anything to do with you. That's how it was in Jesus' day. It's still that way today. And it's only going to change if people follow Jesus who went to the other side. You got to be willing to go to the other side. So let's follow Jesus there. All right, so Jesus says to his disciples, let's go to the other side. And as I just pointed out, there's more in that statement than meets the eye, right? Let's go to the other side. And the disciples were probably not real happy about this. They didn't go to the other side, but they're following Jesus, so into the boat they go, and what an adventure awaited them. First on the sea as they're getting there, and then when they get out of the boat on the other side, oh my, that's next week's story. Okay. So they get into the boat, they set out, and as they sail along, Jesus falls asleep. Now, Mark, in his version of the story, tells us that it was evening. So after a long day of teaching people and healing people, Jesus is exhausted. Remember, Jesus was not only fully God, he was also fully what? Fully human, right? He was a human being, and as a human being, he was tired. He was so tired that when this violent storm swept down on the lake and threatened to swamp the boat, that Jesus slept right through it. Now think about this. The boat is pitching back and forth, right? Because it's big wave action. Boat's pitching back and forth. The wind is howling. It had to be loud. Lake spray is flying everywhere. Everyone's getting soaked. The men are screaming frantically, trying to save their lives, and Jesus sleeps through that. That's tired. I can remember when we had little kids. They'd cry in the middle of the night. I would hear them, and I was just so tired, I stayed asleep and let Lena take care of it. I understand this. So Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat. He's tired. Now the storm, remember I said the geography is going to be important. Here it comes. The storm really wasn't that unusual because Lake Galilee was 700 feet below sea level. It was also only 30 miles from very tall mountains just to the northeast. Mount Hermon rises 9,200 feet above sea level. 30 miles to the northeast of Lake Galilee. So almost 10,000 feet high, 700 feet below sea level, just 30 miles apart. By the way, see the snow there? Yeah, that's Mount Hermon. That's where modern Israelis ski today. Isn't that cool? So that gives you an idea of the contrast. From a ski resort, 30 miles, you're down to 700 feet below sea level. And the cold air coming off the mountain would meet the warm air rising up from the lake and create sudden and very violent storms like this one. So here they are. They're in this storm. They're fighting for their lives, and Jesus is asleep. Now, thing to remember is some of these men in the boat actually made their living on the lake, right? Some of them were fishermen, so they'd been on the boat. They'd seen storms like this before, seasoned sailors. But this storm was so violent that even these men were afraid for their lives. It's usually the experts who recognize the need to panic. You can think about that one. Take that home. This storm was so violent, even these men were afraid. Their boat was swamping. They were in great danger. And you can just see them hauling down the sail, bailing for all they're worth. And then finally, one of them turns to Jesus and shakes him awake. Master, we're going to drown. And in Mark's version of the story, they actually add this little thing. They say, don't you care if we drown? I think that's interesting. Don't you care if we drown? Isn't it interesting that we interpret Jesus' silence or inactivity as a lack of concern, a lack of care? How quickly we assume that Jesus doesn't care. We interpret God's inactivity as a sign that he doesn't care, but that's not true. Have you ever been so overwhelmed that you thought you were going down? Maybe you're going down for the count, and you wonder, God, don't you see what's going on? Don't you see what's happening in my life? Don't you care, God? Ever thought that? Well, hold that thought because we're going to come back to it. So they come to Jesus, they shake him awake, say, don't you care, Lord? We're about to drown. Jesus wakes up. He rebukes the winds and the waves. Shh, he says. And the winds stop, and the waters calm. Can you imagine the look on the disciples' face? Listen, when they shook Jesus awake, they undoubtedly wanted his help. Don't you agree? They wanted Jesus' help, but do you think they were expecting this? I don't think so. I don't think so. In fact, the next thing it says they were all amazed and terrified. They're wondering, who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him. But Jesus asks a question. He turns to them and says, where is your faith? And Mark tells us, he adds this, and why were you so afraid? Now, if I'm one of the disciples in the boat, and I hear him ask that question, I'm thinking, what are you thinking? Why was I so afraid? I was about to drown. That will make you afraid. And where is your faith? What has faith got to do with anything? We're bailing for all we're worth. Well, as we'll see in just a moment, it turns out that faith has everything to do with this situation, which is why Jesus asked the question. All right, so I want to focus on that question at the top of your outline, the question, where is your faith? Where is your faith? Faith has everything to do with surviving the storms in your life. And Jesus made it the central issue of this story. So why did Jesus ask the question? Here's what I'm going to propose tonight. Jesus asked the question because the disciples, in the middle of the storm, the disciples lost their faith because they forgot three very important things. Here they are. I'm going to give them to you right up front. Ready? They forgot Jesus' promise, they forgot Jesus' presence, and they forgot Jesus' power. Like how I did that, they all start with P. Yeah, I work hard at this, folks. Come on. They forgot Jesus' promise, they forgot Jesus' presence, they forgot Jesus' power. I want to explain each one of those. And I'm going to suggest that sometimes we lose our faith in the midst of the storm for the same three reasons. All right, before we continue into this thing, I'm going to invite the ushers to come. If you brought an offering to give tonight, thank you so much for your generosity. If you brought a tithe or an offering, let's give while we're continuing on here as we look at these first 3 points. Okay, ready? Number one, Jesus' promise. And here was the promise. We're going to the other side. We're going to the other side. Look at how the story starts in verse 22. One day Jesus said to his disciples, let's go to the other side. So they got into the boat and set out. So, okay, quick question. Whose idea was it to go to the other side? It was Jesus. This whole thing was Jesus' deal, right? Jesus says we're going to the other side. Here's what I think. If Jesus says we're going to the other side, I think we're going to the other side. Don't you? The problem is that in the midst of the storm, they forgot what Jesus said. And the same thing's true for every one of us. That in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the hardship, it's easy to forget what Jesus said to you earlier that day or a week ago or a month ago or a long time ago. It's easy to forget. Does anybody remember the 1993 NC2A championship game between North Carolina and Michigan's Fab Five? Anyone remember that? Got a few of you here that, okay. So this was a classic matchup, and the very end of the game, North Carolina's ahead by 2. Michigan inbounds the ball. Chris Webber of NBA fame. Chris Webber takes the inbounds pass. He dribbles across the timeline, and 2 NC defenders trap him in the corner with 11 seconds left. And Webber calls a timeout. I think we got a picture of it. There he is. There's Chris Webber calling a real quick timeout. Problem was, Michigan had no timeouts left. And that is a technical foul, which means North Carolina automatically got 2 free throws and the ball and the championship. It cost them the game. Now, afterwards, Webber was interviewed, and he said he heard someone yelling at him from the bench area to call timeout. And in the heat of battle, he did. But he also forgot that in the timeout, remember they were coming out of a timeout, in that timeout, Coach Steve Fisher had told the whole team in the huddle that they had no timeouts left. So he said, don't call timeout, whatever you do. We have no timeouts left. Under pressure, in the heat of the moment, in the middle of the storm, he forgot what the coach said. Ever done that? When we're under pressure, when we're in the storm, it's easy to forget what God told us in our quiet time that morning or the word that he gave us a week ago. And this is why it's so important that we stay connected to Jesus. This is why it's so important to hear from him every day and to remember what he says. I need to hear God's promise. I need to have a word from Jesus and hang on to it. And that's what will keep me steady in the midst of the storm, is if I know the Lord's word to me. So here's a little story. Mid-1990s, Life Center was growing rapidly. We were over on Nora then, and we had just added a 3rd service, and it rapidly filled up. And we began to think about ways to manage our growth. And we were debating, should we add a 4th service, or should we plant a church? And as we prayed about it, talked about it, thought about it, we felt like God spoke to us and gave us direction. This was a word from the Lord that we were to plant a new church instead of adding a 4th service. And so we did a whole bunch of research and dreaming and thinking. We came up with a plan. Our plan was that we were going to hive off 200 people from our church to another part of town and start a new church there, and then take 2 years and let the seats fill back up. And then we would do it all over again. So here's what we did. We hired a church planter, a guy I knew, and we gave him what we described as an unlimited fishing license. That means you could ask anyone you want in our church to go with you. And he did. He asked our staff. He asked our church council. He asked our key leaders and volunteers. He even asked for a list of the biggest donors and went after them. It created a little tension. But I'd given him that permission, so there he went. Well, when it came time to go, when that September rolled around and it was time to go, remember we thought we'd send a couple hundred people. Well, 400 people. That represented 1/4 of our church. We were about 1,600 people at the time. And 400 of them, 1/4 of the church, decided to go to this new church plant. And it was members of our staff, and it was half our worship team, half our drama team, half our kids ministry, a huge number of our highest level leaders went to this thing. 1/4 of our people went with them, and guess what? 1/4 of the offerings went with them too. In one Sunday, gone. Now, normally, when 1/4 of your church leaves and takes their money with them in one Sunday, that is what? A disaster. That's what it is. It's a disaster. It's trouble. And there were moments, I got to tell you, there were moments as this thing took shape, as we saw this storm brewing, and we saw this thing taking shape, and we realized, this was going to be huge. There were moments, kind of catch your breath moments. You know what I'm saying? Where you're going, what have we done? Are we out of our minds? What's going to happen? But what kept us on course? Does anyone know? What kept us hoeing that row straight? We had a word from God, right? We had a word from God, and we reminded ourselves in the midst of that storm, when things got scary, when we started feeling anxious, when we got a little worried, we just reminded ourselves, God told us to do this. God told us to do this. And if we're doing what God told us to do, we're going to be okay. And we were. In fact, the next week, so we sent that church off, and the next week, our attendance wasn't down by 400. It was down by 40. It hadn't taken 2 years to fill the seats. It had taken 1 week. 1 week. And the next year, yeah, that's cool. And the next year, we made budget every month. Now, how do you do that? How do you give away a fourth of your church and a fourth of your money and still make budget every month? Well, you do it because God said, we're going to the other side. And we got in the boat and sailed with him. Does that make sense? Do you have a word from the Lord? Has God spoken to you? If you hang on to that word, don't forget it. And you don't need to be afraid. You don't need to be worried. But if you are afraid, because sometimes when you get in the boat and you're in the middle of the storm, it can be scary. When you are afraid, the best thing you do is what the disciples did. They finally went straight to Jesus, right? They finally woke Jesus up and got him engaged. And of course, Jesus stilled the storm. Just a few weeks ago, I was feeling a lot of anxiety for a friend of mine who had lost his job. This is a friend that I care deeply about, and I was worried for him. That would be a polite way of saying it, but I was really anxious. And so I was praying, and I would describe this, I was praying hard. Do you know what I mean when I say I was praying hard? I was praying with a lot of feeling, a lot of emotion. And in the midst of this prayer, and it went on for quite some time, in the midst of this prayer, the Lord spoke to me, and here's what God said. He said, Joe, I love this guy just as much as I love you. And I'm going to take care of him. Thanks for your concern, Joe, but I've got this. I've got this. So take a deep breath and trust me. That was the word that I needed to hear. That was the word that calmed my inner storm and reduced my anxiety. God's got this. I don't have to be afraid. And what I'm suggesting, friends, is that when you're in the midst of the storm, the thing you want to do is anchor yourself on the word of the Lord. Anchor yourself on the thing that God has spoken to you. And keep going back to that word. Hang on to that. And you say, well, if I don't have one, then do what I did. Go to Jesus. Go to Jesus and say, Lord, what are you saying to me? In the midst of this storm, what are you saying, Lord? Because I need to hang on to that. That's my anchor. My anchor is the word of the Lord. In the midst of the storm, it's easy to be overwhelmed with fear. All of us have felt that. Pretty hard not to be afraid when water is swamping your boat, when your child has just died, when your business is going under and your house is about to be taken from you, when the doctor says it's cancer, when your future suddenly looks uncertain. Pretty natural to be afraid. Fear is a natural response. Faith is a supernatural response. That is, it goes beyond what's natural. And in that moment, in the midst of the storm, the best thing you can do is to turn to Jesus and say, Lord, remind me of what you said, or speak to me now. And you'll hear Jesus say, we're going to the other side. We're going to the other side. And if Jesus says we're going to the other side, then friends, we're going to the other side, storm or not. So first they forgot Jesus' promise. Secondly, they forgot Jesus' presence. They forgot Jesus' presence. Jesus is in your boat. Jesus is in your boat. Would you just turn to the person next to you, look him in the eye and tell him that. Say, Jesus is in your boat. Some of you are going, I didn't even know I had a boat. Jesus is in your boat. All right, so I want you to think about this for a moment, okay? So they're in the midst of the storm, right? The waves are crashing. Jesus is asleep in the back. I said they forgot. They forgot that Jesus. Here's the thing. Jesus has been with these guys for some time now, and they've seen him do a lot of miraculous stuff, and they've heard him talk a lot, and they realize that Jesus, this is dawning on them. Jesus is God's son. This isn't just any ordinary human being. Jesus is God's son. Jesus has been sent from heaven, from the Father, to come and bring God's kingdom to earth. So they have this dawning awareness. But in this moment, in the midst of the storm, they kind of forget about all that. But if you step back from our perspective and you look at it and you go, okay, hang on, guys. God's Son is in your boat. Do you think God's going to let him drown in a boating accident? I mean, can you picture the scene in heaven? Michael the archangel shows up. God, sorry, but we got a little problem here. But a boating accident on Lake Galilee, and we lost Jesus. Storm came up kind of sudden. He wasn't wearing a life jacket. What can I say? We just lost him. God shakes his head and goes, oh, man, this is bad. I got to come up with plan B now. I don't know what we're going to do. Is that going to happen? Of course not. That's not going to happen. Jesus was in their boat. And if Jesus is in their boat, they're not going down. And Jesus is in your boat. If you've invited Jesus into your life, Jesus is in your boat. And he's there all the time, even in the midst of the storms. Jesus is in your boat. When I was diagnosed with cancer in 2006, Jesus was in our boat. And Lena can tell you this, we walked out of the doctor's office after we got the diagnosis. We went out and sat in our car, and I looked at Lena, and she looked at me, and she said, are you okay? And here's what I told her. I said, I woke up this morning in God's hands. I'm still in God's hands, so nothing's changed. Jesus was in my boat. I didn't have to be afraid. 6 months later, when we lost our son in the fall of 2006, that was easily the biggest storm in our lives. But Lena and I discovered again that Jesus was in our boat. Don't misunderstand me. It doesn't mean we didn't feel the pain. We did, and it was awful pain. But we also knew that we weren't alone, that we weren't sailing through that storm on our own. We knew that we were going to the other side. 2006 was a bad year. But we got to the other side of it because Jesus was in our boat. If you look up in the Bible, the words, do not be afraid. They're in there a lot. In fact, I think it's the most often repeated command in the Bible. Don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. What's the phrase that most often follows it? Don't be afraid, for I am with you, right? Don't be afraid, for I am with you. Jesus is in your boat. So we asked them, where's your faith? Because they forgot that Jesus was in the boat. Now, in their defense, I got to come to the disciples' defense here. I do want to point out that eventually it did come to them, right? Eventually, they remembered that Jesus was in the boat. It finally dawned on someone, hey, wait a minute. Jesus is here, asleep in the back. Let's go wake him up. He could help us. And in a panic, they woke him up. And I do want to say that it's better to come to Jesus in a panic than not come at all, right? Eventually, they did the right thing. Eventually, they came to Jesus for help. Eventually, they finally remembered, hey, Jesus is in the boat, and they turned to him. And so I'm asking you tonight, because a lot of you raised your hands. You're in the midst of a storm. Have you gone to Jesus yet? Have you turned to him and asked him for help? Jesus is in your boat. Here's the thing. Maybe Jesus will calm the storm. Or maybe Jesus will simply calm you and help you get to the other side of the lake. But either way, if Jesus is in your boat, you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. Jesus says, don't be afraid, for I'm with you. He's in your boat. Don't forget that. And here's the last thing. Number 3, Jesus' power. They forgot Jesus' power, that he can do anything. Now, I mentioned that by this point in Luke's Gospels, the disciples have seen Jesus do a lot of crazy things. They've seen him forgive sinners. They've seen him drive out demons. They've seen him heal all kinds of sick people, give sight to the blind, make the deaf hear, make the lame walk. Lepers have been cured. He produced a miraculous catch of fish that convinced Peter to follow him. He even raised the dead. So they've seen Jesus do a lot of stuff that really only God can do. Now, granted, they haven't seen Jesus calm a storm, but they've seen enough other miracles and acts of power, enough to know That Jesus could do pretty much anything. Jesus could do pretty much anything. Nothing's too hard for him. But in the midst of the storm, they forgot that. And it's easy to forget, isn't it? All these things are easy to forget in the midst of the storm when you're bailing for your life. Have you ever been in the midst of a storm and then just suddenly it dawns on you, you know what? I haven't prayed yet. Has that happened to anybody besides? Am I the only one? Oh, my word. I've done that so many times. You know, I told you just a few moments ago about praying anxiously for my friend who lost his job. And I want to just let you know again, it was anxious prayer. It was anxious prayer until God reminded me that he's got this. I often catch myself doing that. I often catch myself worrying about things, fretting about things. And then in the midst of my worry and fretting, I suddenly remember, wait a minute, God's powerful, right? Why am I worrying about this? Why aren't I just bringing this to him and asking for his help? He could take care of this. And so that's exactly what the Bible tells us to do. Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. It's on page 1013. I'd like you to turn there, please. Page 1013, Philippians chapter 4. And we're going to read this out loud together. Page 1013, Philippians 4, verse 6. It starts with the words, do not be anxious. And we'll read verses 6 and 7 together out loud. Are you ready? Here we go. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Anxiety or worry ought to be a catalyst to prayer. And what I mean by that is every time you catch yourself worrying, every time you catch yourself feeling anxious, it ought to be a reminder, I need to pray about this. I need to turn to Jesus. He's in my boat. He's powerful. He can do anything. So I should bring my worries, bring my fears, bring my anxieties to him. And what will happen? It says here, and the peace of God that passes all understanding will guard your hearts and minds. Scott Crepane sang a song a few years ago, and in the song he said, sometimes he, Jesus, calms the storm, and other times he calms his child. But either way, the result is peace. What are you worried about tonight? Jesus says, peace, be still. What are you afraid of tonight? Jesus says, peace, be still. And what's that storm that you raised your hand about? That storm you're in the middle of? Jesus says, peace, be still.